All right, guys, so in this lesson, we're going to start at the very beginning and talk about what Bootstrap is and what it's used for. So Bootstrap is an open source front-end CSS or UI framework used for developing responsive websites and user interfaces. And it's been around for over a decade, and it's become extremely popular over the years. As it's easy to use, it offers a wide range of pre-designed components such as buttons, alerts, navigation bars, and much more. And in addition to those types of UI components, you also get utility classes to help you develop faster. For instance, if you want to add margin or padding, you have classes to do that, whether it's all around, top, bottom, right, left. You have classes for display and positioning. There's also a responsive grid system for column-based layouts, and it offers a lot of JavaScript components like carousels and collapsible content. So it has a lot to it and allows you to do things a lot faster, which I'll talk about in a minute. So as far as prerequisites go, it's really important that you learn the basics and fundamentals of HTML and CSS before jumping into any framework. And in order to understand many of the classes, especially the utility classes, you need to understand what they're doing as far as CSS goes and what you're going to use them for. For example, if you don't understand positioning, position relative, position absolute, then you're not going to know what the position absolute class does. Okay, if you don't understand spacing in CSS, you're not going to know how to use the margin and padding classes. So once you get the basics of HTML and CSS down, then you can move to Bootstrap and move a lot faster. So let's talk about some of the advantages of Bootstrap. So responsive design. Bootstrap is responsive by nature. In fact, it's what we call a mobile-first approach, which means that it prioritizes the design and development of mobile-friendly websites and applications. Now, just because it's a mobile-first framework doesn't mean that you have to design mobile-first. In fact, I very rarely do. I usually start off with the large screen with desktop, and then I'll go ahead and add media queries or anything that I need to, responsive classes and stuff for smaller screens. So you can develop in many different ways. So rapid development, Bootstrap saves a ton of time. In some cases, you will write custom CSS, but not much. Most of the custom CSS that I write when I'm using Bootstrap is for things like background images with overlays and animation. So prototyping, since it allows you to do things very quickly, it's great for just getting something up and running. If you're more of a back-end developer and you're creating an application, but you're more focused on, the back-end, the functionality, the API, and you just need something to throw up so that you can see and interact with the application, then Bootstrap gives you great tools to be able to do that. It's very customizable. There's a few ways to do it, but you can compile your own version of the Bootstrap CSS file. And the main way to do that is by using Sass, which is a style language. And we'll be using Sass in the 5 projects that we're going to be building. We're going to basically take the Bootstrap Sass files, and we're going to edit the variables, not edit, but overwrite some of the variables to customize colors and shadows and borders and all that stuff. And then we'll compile it into our own custom Bootstrap CSS that we can then include in our HTML. Now, one of the other great things about Bootstrap is the JavaScript plugins, because with a lot of other CSS frameworks, such as Tailwind, which I do love, but Tailwind doesn't have the capability of modals and drop downs and carousels, and Bootstrap does. And this can be very, very helpful for people that are not great with JavaScript and they can't build these things themselves. So we'll be looking into quite a bit of that stuff, making our pages more dynamic. And then the documentation for Bootstrap, I think, is great, at least in my own opinion. Whenever I need to figure something out, I can always find it really easily, and there's always multiple examples. And then, of course, it's cross-browser compatible. It works great across different browsers, different versions of browsers, different operating systems. So that, of course, is something you need. All right, so I just want to address this. Is Bootstrap dead? Because this is something I've heard quite a few times over the past, I'd say, year or so, since Tailwind has become very popular. Now, you might hear this from a few influencers. I think that in reality, Bootstrap is heavily used in the enterprise level and startups with freelancers. So it's worth learning no matter what area you plan to work in. Tailwind is another great framework. I use it. I even have a course on it. However, some people really, really hate it due to the amount of classes that you have in your HTML. Because Tailwind is all utility classes. There's no button components or alerts or anything like that. You do it all by utility classes. And some people don't like that. And where do those people go if they want to use a framework? They go to Bootstrap. So I think that they play off one another. You know, they both offer different things. So I think Bootstrap will always be the alternative to Tailwind. So the only people that really say Bootstrap or anything for that matter, that say things are dead, are influencers that want views and people that never really worked as a developer in the real world. Because in the real world, people don't care what the cool thing is to use. They care what will get the job done and get it done in a sufficient amount of time. And Bootstrap is one of those technologies that really increases your productivity. And because of that, it's not going anywhere. I was big in the freelance world, and freelancing is all about getting things done fast because you have a ton of clients. A lot of times you only have yourself to depend on, so you need tools like this. You can't just do everything custom. So it's not dead and it's not going anywhere. Some large companies that use Bootstrap today are Twitter, Spotify, LinkedIn, Udemy, Upwork, and many more. So I just want to put that notion to bed. All right, so in the next video, I'm going to just quickly go over the different ways on how you can use Bootstrap, and then we'll go ahead and start to get set up with the Bootstrap sandbox. Okay, so this will be a quick video. This is more for absolute beginners that really have no idea how to get started. So I want to show you the different ways on how you can use Bootstrap. So the first way is using a CDN, a content delivery network, where basically you include the Bootstrap CDN links into your HTML, and this includes the CSS and the JavaScript files, and you include them directly from a remote server. And this is the easiest and quickest way to get started. So the links will look something like this. You'll have a link tag with a CSS file called either bootstrap.css or bootstrap.min.css. And then you'll also have the JavaScript, which will be in a script tag, and that will typically be the bundle, which also includes the popper library, because in order to use the JavaScript popovers and the tooltips, those actually use the popper.js library, which before you actually had to include that and jQuery. Now Bootstrap doesn't depend on jQuery anymore, so we don't need that, and the popper library is actually included in the bundle, so you only need these two tags. All right, so that's the first way, and I can actually just show you that real quick. So I'm going to jump into VS Code, and you don't have to do any of this. I'm going to show you how to get set up with everything with your text editor and stuff in the next video. But just to give you an idea, so if I go to Docs and then Download and come down here, you'll see the links here. So I'm going to grab the link tag, and then in my index.html, I'm going to just add a boilerplate here, and it doesn't really matter. I'm not keeping this. I'm just going to throw that link in there. And then if I wanted to use any JavaScript widgets or even the drop down for the hamburger menu in the nav bar, you need this JavaScript. So that we could put down here right above the ending body tag. All right, now if I were to put a button in here and give it a Bootstrap class like btn and btn-primary, and I'll just say submit. And then if I were to open this, I'll just use live server, which I'll talk about in the next video. You can see that that button is formatted, right? It has the Bootstrap styling. So if I didn't have this link and I use those classes, then obviously it's just a regular ugly HTML button. But by including this CDN, it works, right? We're using the Bootstrap CSS. Now, the next way to use Bootstrap is to download the files. So you're essentially doing the same thing, but instead of using the CDN links, you're using the files that you actually have on in your local environment, which can be better because it's local. So if there's no internet connection, it still works. You're not reaching out to a remote server. So for that, you would just come to this download page, and you have two options. You have the source files, which includes the SAS, which I'll explain that next, and then you have the compiled CSS and JavaScript. So you could download this, the compiled, and if we open that up, and you'll see the CSS folder. So there's different things here for like if you want to use just the grid or whatever, but what you're going to look for is the Bootstrap min CSS. And if I put that over here, and then for the JavaScript, the Bootstrap min JS, put that over here. Okay, and now instead of including the link to the CDN, what I would do is just include a link to, usually I'd have it in a CSS folder, but right now it's in the root, so I'll just go ahead and do that, and we shouldn't need those. And then for the JavaScript, I would just, for the source, I'd just say Bootstrap min JS. Okay, now if I save that and we go back, we should still see the button styles because now I'm including Bootstrap locally. If I comment that out, then it's not going to work. All right, so that's another way you can use it. Now the more complicated but most customizable way of using it is by compiling SAS, but from the source files, because if you do it the other two ways that I just showed you, then you're always going to have like this color for BTN primary unless you overwrite it with your own CSS, which isn't the best way to do things. It can get really messy. So the best way to do that, if you want to change up colors and stuff, which you should because you don't want all your sites to look the same, then you would compile SAS. And the way there's a couple ways you can do that. One, you can download the source files from that page I just showed you. That will include all the SAS files. You do need a SAS compiler, and I'm going to get into all that later. You can also install Bootstrap with a package manager such as NPM, which is the Node package manager, and we're going to do that as well. So we're going to create this environment for our 5 websites that will include installing Bootstrap, installing SAS, even installing Font Awesome with NPM, and then compiling the SAS files, changing variables, and basically creating our own custom Bootstrap CSS. All right, so in the next video, I'm going to just talk a little bit about our environment and what you'll need, which really isn't much. Very simple setup to start using Bootstrap, and then we'll start to get into it. Okay, so I just want to go over some of the basic tools that you'll need for this course, which isn't much at all. So the first thing you need is obviously a text editor. You need something to write code with, and it's really up to you on what you use, but what I use and what I recommend is Visual Studio Code. It is cross-platform, so it doesn't matter which operating system you're using. It's easy to use, it's intuitive, it's very, very popular. I'd say it's the most popular in the web dev world, at least for front end. And it has excellent extensions as well, and just an excellent ecosystem. So that's what I suggest. At the end of this video, I'm going to show you some of the extensions that I think work well with this course as well. All right, so next thing you're going to need is Node.js, and don't let that scare you. So if you're just getting into, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime which allows JavaScript to run on your machine outside of the browser. So you can use JavaScript on the server. However, we're not writing Node.js applications. The reason that you need to install it is because we're going to be using NPM, which is the Node package manager, and that allows us to install packages, which could be anything from a framework to a library to just a very simple tool. We're going to be using that in our 5 main projects, and we'll be installing Bootstrap with NPM. We'll also be installing SAS as well as Font Awesome. So we need NPM for our environment for the final project. So that's why you need to have it installed. So just go to nodejs.org. You can download the long-term support or the current version, and you just go through the steps and get it installed. Very, very simple. And then I'd also suggest installing Git, which is a version control system. And there's a couple reasons you should install this. One is to version control your project so that you can back things up and you can, roll back to a certain point if you need to. But even if you don't do that, we're using it to deploy a couple of our projects. So the first project and the third project we're going to be deploying, one to Vercel, which is a hosting service, which is fantastic. It's going to be absolutely free, no credit card info or anything like that. Same thing with Netlify, which is what we're going to use on the third project. So with both of those platforms, you first need to use Git and push to GitHub. So you also need a GitHub account. And then you can basically just deploy that project by selecting the GitHub repository. So you can install Git by going to git-scm.com, or if you're on a Mac, you can use Homebrew. There's quite a few ways to install Git. So I would definitely suggest that you get that set up on your system. Now I just want to quickly go over some of the extensions and settings I have in VS Code that I do recommend and I will be using throughout the course. So if you click on this icon right here, this will show you all of the extensions you have installed, which I have quite a few, and you don't need really any of these aside from, I'd say, 2 that we'll be using in the course. So the first one is Live Server. And again, if you're using a different text editor, you can use a different solution for this, but I would suggest some kind of server and not just opening your HTML file through your file system. So what Live Server does is it gives you a local development server, and it will run on your local host, and it will also update every time you change something and save it, whether it's in the HTML, the CSS, or the JavaScript. So once it's installed, and I'll just give you an example real quick. So I have this index.html, and I can right click and either say open with Live Server, or I can click on this Go Live button right here. And what that'll do is it'll open my project, my index.html, on my local host 127001, which is my loopback address, and then port 5500, and then my index.html. So it gives you a little server. It's a more real life environment than just opening it on your file system. All right, now if I change something here, like let's say I get rid of the word world and save, you'll see now it updated and I didn't even have to refresh the page. So it comes in handy, it's great for productivity, and we will be using it throughout the whole course from the sandbox to our 5 main projects. So I would suggest getting that installed. Now, to stop it, you can just either click this port button or you can say stop with Live Server. And now this won't work anymore. All right, so that's the first one. I'd also suggest installing Prettier, which is a code formatter. And I have it set so that when I save my file, it will format automatically. So in this index.html, if I, let's say, have this h1 way over here, and then maybe I have a paragraph here, and, that obviously isn't formatted very well. So if I hit Command S and I save, it'll pop back into place. So to make that happen, if it doesn't already, just go to your settings. So you can go to this gear and then settings, or you can do Command or Control comma. That'll also open your settings, and then just search for format, and this checkbox right here, format on save, is what you want to check. And then as far as other options, we're not writing a lot of JavaScript, but for semicolons, well, I guess this pertains to CSS as well, you can have it add semicolons automatically. So if I go into this style.css, and let's say I forget my semicolon here, as soon as I save, it adds it right away, okay, automatically. And it does that in your JavaScript as well. And then the last thing I want to show you that I'll be using quite a bit is Emmet, which is a tool to write faster HTML and CSS. And it's not something you have to install with VS Code. It just comes by default. But in some editors like Atom and Sublime Text, unless they've changed it, I haven't used those in a while, with those you have to install it as a third-party plugin or extension. So with Emmet, what I can do, let's say I want an H1 with a class of heading. So instead of typing out, my angle brackets and then putting an H1 and typing out class, I could just do H1 dot and then the name of the class, and then hit either enter or tab, and it will format it for me like this. Okay. Now, if I wanted an ID, let's say I wanted an ID of main, I could do $main, and that gives me an ID. If I wanted a class and an ID, I could do h1, let's say main, and then dot, and then heading. And then if I wanted to add another class, I could add on to that, like dark. And there we have an ID and two classes. And if you want to do it on a div, which is the most common element you'll be using, you can type out div, but you don't have to. I could just say dot main or min, whatever, and it'll give me that class. If I want an ID, so I'll say main and, I don't know, class of inner, and it gives me a div with an ID and a class. All right, so that's really the extent, to the extent that I'll be using Emmet in this course. And I just wanted to mention that in case there are some real beginners that don't know what Emmet is and you're wondering why the hell I'm able to do that. And I do have a complete crash course on Emmet on my Travesty Media YouTube channel if you're interested. All right, so that's pretty much it as far as the global tools that you'll be using. When we get into our website projects, we will set up a local environment using NPM, using SAS, and so on. But that's later. We're first going to look at the fundamentals of Bootstrap. We're going to look at all the basic classes, all the utility classes using the sandbox. Then we'll do some mini projects, and then we'll jump into the 5 websites.